So we are standing in the narthex at St. James's, Piccadilly, and it is an honour to be joined by a Royal Academician, an architect, and someone who has a variety of connections with this place and with places like it. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, my name's Elsie Owusu, and yes, I'm an architect, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to meet Revd Ayla, and it's the first time I've ever been here properly. I mean, I've walked through it and I've walked around it, but this is such a splendid church. It's such a lovely space.
Standing here, we are greeted by 4 new paintings from 2023 by the artist Che Lovelace, who works primarily in Trinidad, and this is his first permanent commission in the UK. Working with him in this sacred space was a really exciting opportunity because it allowed us, together with Echo Eshin, the project curator, to think about the sacred in relation to the visual arts today afresh, and also to think about liberation, about legacies of enslavement, and in particular, Kwabna Araba Kugwano. So as we're standing here, what are your impressions of these paintings, and as an architect, the way that they relate to the space that we're in, maybe even its geometry or its sense of flow?
I think these are really quite special paintings. I've seen them online. I've seen them in photographs, but actually standing here and looking at them and looking at this, is it hexagonal space? Orthogonal anyway, is a real pleasure. It's a real treat, and they are just absolutely stunning, beautiful.
The one that we are more or less just in front of now has these 2 figures, and one of the things I love about it is the reflection of the figure on the left in the water and the splash of these white little rivulets, these droplets of water coming towards this figure on the right. And the way in which, for Che Lovelace's work, it seems to connect with these passages of paint that almost fragment it into different kinds of stained glass or different ways of thinking about light and color and shade. Here in this building, it's also positioned between these 2 arches beneath a wooden and lightly gilded canopy, above which is the tower and the bell beyond. And so I'm wondering about what you think about color and about composition in relation to Che Lovelace's work in this part of the building before we go into the main church.
Well, I think for me, the interesting thing about these images and the use of water and reflection is, of course, that Kwabna Kugwano was born in Ajumakun in Ghana, which is a seaside, it's a fishing village, it's a seaside village, and was kidnapped from there when he was 13. So the combination of water and beautiful tropical light and green forest, the implication, the hint at rainforest is really quite special.
If we turn round, we can see the final of the 4 in the series, which doesn't have any human figures, but has a whole array of hummingbirds in flight and this beautiful thicket, these overlapping branches and fronds of these very vibrant palm trees and these leaves with the sun far up above our heads in the upper left-hand corner. I wonder what you think of the relationship between air and space and flight when it comes to a space like this, where it's a bit chilly at the moment, it's towards the end of the day, and as it exists now in this church, we have this open flow between Piccadilly over to our right, to the north, and then this more intimate entrance out to the quieter street of Jermyn Street, and in between, this amazing circular spiraling form of hummingbirds. Birds, flight, inside, outside. What do you think?
Well, the interesting thing for me is that sense of flight and the sense of freedom and light and air and the abstraction of the sun in the top left-hand corner. So it's really a joyful piece which hints at some of the ideas that Kugwana was talking about in terms of liberation and future freedoms.
Would you expect to find paintings like this in a Christopher Wren building? What do you think about the juxtaposition?
I would certainly not expect to find paintings like this in a Christopher Wren building. Although it has to be said that Christopher Wren was a modernist. I mean, you know, his ideas were based on new ideas, humanist ideas, and international travel. So in a sense, in the long frame of history, I think it's very appropriate that they should be here, but most unexpected.
Let's go inside. We are about to go through the glass double doors, monuments on either side, and as we pass through into the church, we are walking underneath a portion of the church interior which is currently being redeveloped and transformed. So immediately, at least at this stage in the church's life, in early 2025, we are confronted by this massive array of scaffolding, the first deck of scaffolding just above our heads, and then the reredos beyond. And as the light is fading in February twilight, the first thing we can see is the light of Grinling Gibbons' reredos with this pelican feeding her babies in the middle. What do you think of this as a first impression?
Well, what I really like about it is that coming through, well, as you say, Jermyn Street on one side, Piccadilly on the other side, and the passage between, coming into this beautiful room, you see the Grinling Gibbons sculpture, beautifully lit, and I suppose it's the promise of completion under this really impressive scaffold. And the other thing I think about this is that with all our technology and with all our knowledge and with machines and electricity, it makes you think how the building was made in Christopher Wren's time, when there were none of these modern benefits, if you like, but the building was built and finished, and all the beautiful details, the carvings and the windows. There is so much light in this room. It's just extraordinary.
One of the things that Christopher Wren apparently really liked about this place, this design, is that it was just an open space next to the intended St. James's Square. It was still sort of seen as central London, but in a way that was completely different from the built-up and medieval areas in and around the city of London, where Christopher Wren had been working on not only St. Paul's, but also a myriad number of churches after the Great Fire of London in the late 17th century. This building's completion date is 1684, and the relationship between the Grinling Gibbons details and the way that Gibbons handles space, if I can put it that way, and tells different stories of creation and Christianity, and the way that Wren wanted to ensure that this building was filled with clear glass, filled with light. It was possible to hear and see, to learn and experience. I wonder what you think about how Christopher Wren's vision, especially with all of that clear glass, relates to the wider symbolism that Grinling Gibbons is also working on in wood and detailed carving.
Well, I suppose what I think about Wren is what a generous architect he was. Because some architects fill up the space so that they are the principal designer. And what Wren does is to design a beautiful interior and then stand back and leave space for other people to show their talent. And this is really clear when you come into this space. The impressive thing is the amount of light, the glazing, how light is allowed into the building, and then just the openness of it, which allows incredibly intricate carvings like the Gibbons carving to have to be a showcase for other people's talent. So I just, I suppose, generosity is the word that comes to mind. Not just the beauty and the clarity of design, but the generosity.
I think that's a beautiful way of considering what Christopher Wren's kind of ethos was. And as we walk over here, we can take a look in the corner of the building at Grinling Gibbons' font. And this was the font where Kwabna Araba Kugwano, born on a Tuesday, was baptized here as a teenager on the 20th of August, 1773. He would have been familiar with this church because he lived nearby in the home of Richard and Maria Causeway. There's a blue plaque for him on Pall Mall. And so to access this church, the most likely thing would have been that he would have walked up from south to north and perhaps through St. James's Square, and he could have entered St. James's via the south door, which was part of Christopher Wren's original plan. The south door hasn't been in use since the 19th century when it was bricked up because the desire was for more seating, more pews, good old Victorians packing them in, you know. And so now what we plan to do is return, if we can think about it this way, in this moment, the entrance that Kugwano himself would have walked through in order to experience this church, and perhaps even on that day in August, on the day of his baptism. What do you think of that idea? We're bringing that door back.
I think it's really brilliant and really appropriate. And one of the things I really like about the way this church treats not just its buildings, but the people who, in my view, still inhabit the buildings, people like Kugwano, is the respect that it shows for their memory. And by showing that respect, the church enriches not just the space, but its community as well. So, you know, for somebody like Kugwano, who was kidnapped at the age of 13, to still be remembered and still be a part of this community is a really great thing. And it's almost, you can almost feel the presence of people like him and people like Mariah and Richard Causeway and the abolitionists, and how they would have been inspired. I mean, when Kugwano was baptized, he took the name John Stewart, I think.
Yes, that's right.
He took the name John Stewart. And John Stewart, it just sounds such a very common local name, but he did always remember his birth name, which was Kwabna, born on a Tuesday, Otoba, which may have been something to do with twin, I don't know, sounds like that to me, in Kugwano. And he still remembered in the area, Ajamako, from where he was kidnapped. So, you know, from the coast of what is now Ghana, the Gold Coast or the Slave Coast, to the middle of Piccadilly is such a long journey, but also a very short one in terms of history and memory.
I wonder, as we make our way around the font in this really atmospheric evening light, also a Grinling Gibbons font, and you can hear the building works behind us. We have Noah's Ark just here, and then from where we're standing on the left is an image in very high relief of the baptism of Christ. And then around the other side, quite unusually, you don't often see this depicted, but I'm delighted that it's depicted here, especially considering Kugwano's history. This is from the New Testament book of Acts, and it's a moment where an Ethiopian of high social rank is in a chariot. He's reading a scroll from the prophet Isaiah, and he thinks to himself, I want to know more about what I'm reading. I want to understand better what kind of divine tradition this comes from, and maybe how to get involved. And so these two people, as followers of Jesus, come and meet him and say, let's have a conversation. And so they hop in and they chat. And the conclusion of this really intelligent, thoughtful African person in the New Testament is to say, well, there's some water over there. What's to prevent me from being baptized? And Jesus' apostles who meet him on the way say, nothing. And so it's become a very precious story in Scripture about the purpose as well as the inspiration of the relationship between education and conversation, asking deep questions, and seeking baptism. Kugwano would have seen this. He may have touched it. This may have been the space, the place where he would have leaned over and would have spent time with someone in the presence of God naming him. And so if we go back to that idea of name, most likely the name at that moment of baptism would have been John Stewart. I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. And yet his birth name is retained in what he wrote in his book in 1787 and then in his second edition. And so we were thinking about this when we were looking at how to craft and design a new memorial for Kwabna Araba Kugwano, which is on the wall just to your left. It's just here. Feel free to get right up close, and you can touch it, run your hands over it, do whatever you like with it, really. What do you think?
Well, it's very interesting because in Marylebone Church, there is a similar... Do you know Marylebone Church?
Yes.
Is there a similar memorial in Marylebone Church?
As in a similar kind of look, or
It looks like the same hand.
Ah, yes. It's by Cardozo Kindersley, their workshop in Cambridgeshire. So this memorial is from 2023. It is brand new.
Okay. And what is Cardozo Kindersley?
They are a stone letter cutter firm who do a number of contemporary memorials. They do secular as well as sacred memorials. You know Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey? Yeah. Their work is all over the place in that. So they, are fairly traditional in the way that they think about the craft of letter cutting. And it's... Lida Cardozo Kindersley, who runs that studio now.
Oh, and is one of them Richard? The only reason I asked that is because I worked with somebody called Richard Kindersley on the Supreme Court.
That sounds very likely.
And he was a letterer, one of the second generation of letterers, and worked with, anyway. So it's just quite startling because it looks so familiar.
It's very likely, yes, and that makes a lot of sense. What is it about it that you recognize as you look at it? Is it something about the scale or the technique? Something about the curve of the letters?
No, it's just the hand. I mean, they look very similar. The carving is very similar. The typeface, the font is the same, I would say. I have it in my mind. But I suppose the interesting thing about this is the fact of his name, the fact of that Kwabna, and it's the Kwabna that says that he's an Akan. He's from his clan is the Akan, and he's a Fanti. Well, he could be any number of things, but my mother's a Fanti. So that's interesting to me. But it's also that Kwabna is spelt with a Q in the old way and not the way that my brother's name, who's also Kwabna, Kwabena. And I've never, when I first saw it, I thought, oh, he was born on a Tuesday, that's interesting. But I've never heard anybody else say, because that tells you a bit about his history. So there's this 13-year-old boy who was born on a Tuesday and was kidnapped and taken to the Caribbean, but retained his name. And lots of enslaved people had their names changed and accepted that they had their names would be changed. But the interesting thing is, as you said before, he was baptized. He took John Stewart as his Christian name, but retained this very strong sense of his own history. And I think he was considered to be, of the abolitionists, one of the most radical. And his book has been described as a Jeremiad, which is after the prophet Jeremiah and all the radical things that he said in the Bible. So it's just on this very smallish piece of stone, there is just a huge amount of history and memory and hope, aspiration, and collective thought are just extraordinary. And it is I have to say, that book is a hard read. It is a hard read, but absolutely worth every minute spent.
We thought quite carefully about what the language might be, because his precise date of birth is slightly uncertain, and his date of death, as far as I'm aware, as far as folks have figured it out, is also unknown. It's not recorded, and so this monument kind of works differently to a number of other monuments that you would expect here and in other places, and so the description of who he is, what he did, his vocation, if you like, became precious here. An abolitionist, an activist, and an author. And then the title of the book, of Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil of Slavery. I'm curious about the relationship between thinking and feeling, and the way that he uses evil in its, if you like, proper kind of Christian theological context in so much of what he writes, in order to state that it is simply impossible to condone in any way, or to allow, or to collude, or to enslave another human being. You cannot do that and be a Christian at the same time. And here then, the next word is baptized in this church on the 20th of August, 1773. What do you think, as we look at it here, about the description of this person in relation to the history of this church? And this is a kind of an object, a fragment of a bigger story in stone. As an architect, you work with stone and you think about history all the time. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think it's great. It looks like stone. You know, it's not pretending to be anything other than what it is, which is a lovely piece of carved stone. And I think he would have been delighted to be called an activist. I think of the words that are used about him, I think all the A's. I think he was also an absolutist, in the sense that he thought that slavery and Christianity were inimical, which is interesting because there were other abolitionists who were a bit more measured in their criticism. So Kugwano was very critical of some of the Clapham abolitionists, in the sense that they thought that you could take a slower and more measured, in quotation marks, approach to abolition, and you didn't want to frighten the horses. And of course, people like Alauda Quiano were slave owners in their own right. So he took a very, very dim view of black people, African people, feeling that it was okay for them to own slaves, own the bodies of other people, whilst at the same time campaigning for abolition. And of course, he would have known Jefferson, who came to stay with and knew the Cosways, Richard and Maria, whose servant Kugwano was. And of course, we know about Jefferson and his own relationships with slaves, and Sally Hemings, who was his servant, who he took to, I think I'm right in saying he took to Paris with him when she was 14. And I mean, at that, nowadays, and even in those days, it was considered to be extremely poor behaviour. And, you know, you kind of think that Kugwano would have seen all this and have been critical of it, even if he didn't speak his mind. He was a very plain-speaking person. So it'd be interesting to know more about him. But I suppose the thing I like about this is that it's such a strong memorial to him, and it just reminds you how little you do know about him. We don't know where he's buried. We don't know when he died. We actually don't know the exact date of his birth. But we do have this powerful testament, thoughts and sentiments on the evil of slavery, and the fact that he spoke plainly about what he considered to be this terrible blight on humanity.
St. James's is going through a number of transformations at the moment. As you know, this church is filled with scaffolding. We have this little temporary kind of hut around this new door to the south. And this project is absolutely putting Cugoano's name here rightfully in this place next to the font, and together with Che Lovelace's paintings, it's part of that overall spirit of 21st century transformation, which incorporates history in a way that here we describe as doing our best and sometimes failing and needing to start again and needing to ask questions and to be deeply accountable as best we can as we learn, doing our best to tell our history honestly. To me, having this reminds me that this is a fragment of a much bigger story of all of the monuments and memorials which are not here, in a sense, of all that continues to go unvoiced. And I wonder, as part of the overall anticipated transformation of St. James's and in your own 21st century context, as an architect, as someone who was in Parliament today advocating for better housing and thinking seriously about people's well-being and people's lives in terms of spaces and dignity in the UK today, what difference does it make to you that these are the kinds of projects with Cugoano's name for us right now front and center in a place like this and in a church in particular? What difference do you think that makes?
Well, it's really interesting to have this very clear link to Ghana, which is where I was born, and from the Gold Coast, from the Slave Coast, from slavery, to this place in central London. I mean, it is the most extraordinary thing. And so to know that, when I found out that he was from Ajamako, I did try and identify a young person of the same age of 13, also called Kwabena, which would have been, I haven't been able to do it yet, but it would have been just a lovely thing, because quite often I think enslavement is an abstract, comes over as an abstract issue. It's it's a theological issue, it's a philosophical issue, it's a political issue. But I think to think of a 13-year-old being grabbed when he was playing with his friends, because that's what it is. It's the kidnapping of children. And I think most of the slaves, most of the enslaved people, extraordinarily, would have been children because they were easier to kidnap. And they were easier, that it was part of what was the process of enslavement was called seasoning, which is effectively to break someone's spirit. And children were considered to be so much more malleable. And when you read about the passage, the transatlantic passage, and the fact that they were, even at that age, even at 13, they were making plans to sabotage the ship, and the interesting social dynamic where local women who were prostituted women by the sailors, local women who were being prostituted by the sailors, were paid to sleep amongst the children, so that any plans that they were making would then be reported back and the children would be punished. I mean, the whole dynamic of cruelty, which is, just reminds you of the expression, the banality of evil.
Yeah.
How much do human beings have to be degraded in order to be able to carry out those acts as part of their everyday lives? And the thing about Cugoano is, when you read his book, he brings that to life. And you begin to understand that it wasn't just then they weren't just units, as you see in those drawings. You see those the drawings of the slaves side by side, the enslaved people side by side, and that's dehumanizing and reducing and turning those people into objects. And what Cugoano does, what Kwabena Ottawa Kuguano does, is to bring them back to life, to give them their humanity. So to have this here, this lovely piece of stone here, just reinforces that sense of life and humanity. And that's, again, shown in those paintings in the entry, that sense of resistance and life and hope. So it's great. It's lovely to see. It's a lovely thing.
Thank you. And when you spoke earlier about the idea that you think he would appreciate being called an activist, I'm now looking at this memorial as a kind of composition where text is image as well as being this letter cutting that tells a story, and that tells his story in a way that focuses on the personal as well as the impactful quality of what he wrote, what he thought, what he said. And I've never noticed this before, but the word activist is right in the center.
That's right.
It's right in the heart, in the core.
Yeah.
And if we thought about this as a sort of bird's eye view, one of the things I think about sometimes is that it's very nearly a good size and shape for an altar, if we sort of turned it around.
Yeah.
And the roughness of the stone, as though it's been cut out of something else,
Yeah.
it reminds me of the waves of the Atlantic, as though his name and his vocation, his achievements, and his baptism are almost emblazoned on the surface of a terrifying and of a traumatic and violent crossing. So it's an idea to me that connects the waters of life and baptism to the waters of horror in that history of enslavement. You spoke earlier about making the conceptual into something which is personal, which is real, and connecting with young people in this place where Kuguano as a child was so vulnerable to capture, and indeed that was part of his life. I wonder what you think about the relationship between sacred space and places for honoring memories like this and for conversations like this, and young people, teenagers that we see and that you know and that are part of our lives in different ways in London today. What's possible for young people of Kuguano's age at 13 in that terrible experience in West Africa at 16 when he came here and was touching and connecting with the font that is about 4 feet away from you.
Yeah. Well, the word that comes to mind really is resilience. And, you know, for somebody who went through such an awful experience, to be resilient to the point of learning to read and write, and not only learning to read and write, but to express the thoughts in the depth and complexity that he did in the very short time between being kidnapped and being christened is to me is just an extraordinary thing, and also says what young people can do given the chance. You know, being beaten down, being kidnapped, being tortured, and yet rising through that with activism and a positive approach to hope and the future. So it seems to me that in spite of all the criticism that have always been made of young people through the centuries, through the decades, through the millennia, the thing that really strikes you here is the resilience of the human spirit, of the young human spirit, which is being honoured and celebrated here.
Thank you. So we're standing in a church and we've got some scaffolding right in front of us, and as we move down towards the East End, we can take a good look at this as a kind of a work in progress, and see some people literally working in and around this scaffolding. Hello. How's it going up there? It's all right, apparently. And I'm curious about whether or not you have been in and around a church of this age, or perhaps older or more recent, where these kinds of layers of history are in the process of being transformed, of being renewed. Have you ever worked on an organ project before?
No, never. I don't think I've ever. Oh, I have worked on a church, but it was let's see, it was an Edwardian church in Ealing, St Bernard's Hospital, Ealing. So yes, but I mean this is just an exceptional building. I mean, I've been in St Paul's. I know a little bit about St Paul's. I know a little bit about Notre Dame. But the thing about these churches that always strikes me is just how people make buildings for the joy of it. I mean, you're not making a building to live in or, for sort of practical, but, you're just doing it because to celebrate spirituality and yet they're such big things, they're such big buildings. And it's from the big buildings, that what's learnt from big buildings, as far as I'm aware, my reading of it, that things, edifices like manor houses and, the houses of the wealthy, then take their lessons and understanding of how to craft and celebrate in architecture. And that starts with churches, and it starts with the Romans, not churches, but buildings in recognition of higher powers. That's where architecture starts. That's where big architecture starts, is in sacred buildings. So, that's...
Yeah, that the heart of the architectural endeavor to build something monumental in order to express something which is beyond humanity and yet contained through the limitation of materials, through human ingenuity and imagination. Yes. Someone asked me the other day, what's the purpose of a church? Yes. And I thought, there's so much I can say. How can I explain this? What's the purpose of a church? And I said, the purpose of a church is to encourage people to connect deeply with the source of love and life itself, and to express in some way, with and beyond language, whether it's just sitting, whether it's singing together, whether in a Christian setting, it's the bread and the wine together on a Sunday morning, to express in some way that we are recognizing that we all yearn for belonging, and that we all might have an opportunity to, in some way, notice the depth of gratitude that when we're still and when we're quiet kind of wells up within us, and that maybe that's where quality of art or imagination starts to come from, this sense of being like, I wonder what's possible. I wonder what my imagination can do collectively. Yeah. Maybe that can start in a sacred space like this.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, when I look at medieval buildings and you look at medieval thought and how spirituality was so closely aligned with superstition, and people, not so long ago, and still in Africa, the world of the world beyond the grave and the world that we live in are very, very close. So to me, churches are originated in the sense of speaking to God and saying, as a sort of, a statement of love and a prayer for forgiveness, if you like. Partly it's that. So when you look at Gothic cathedrals, they were got up in the most amazingly swift period of time, and it was partly because the people who had the power to commission the buildings wanted to be buried in them because they wanted to be close to the big chief. I mean, it was kind of...
Those prayers every day.
Yes, that's right. And then they left money for prayers to be said for their soul.
Absolutely.
So I think, to me, churches are a means of communication, a way of speaking to the higher power.
Absolutely.
In the hope that, whatever, a bit like indulgences, the hope that whatever,
yeah, we don't do that anymore.
Whatever naughtiness you got up to in your life, if you build a beautiful church, it's kind of says something about your aspiration and your faith, your belief, and your connection with a higher power, which is interesting because poor people didn't have, people. If you look at these, I think that's interesting about the Kugwana, because he was, in actual fact, a non-person in those days, and the people who are remembered around these walls are people of consequence. They had to pay their way to be here. And their wives and their families, and the plaques say, who they were and their importance in life. And the thing about Kugwana is that he gets his space by talking about people who didn't matter.
Wow. Yeah.
And everybody else is saying, I matter, I'm a rich person, I'm allowed to be
I worked
here.
for the Queen,
Yeah,
I did this thing to extend British territory across the world.
I'm allowed to be here
Sure.
because I can speak to the higher power. And what Kugwana is saying is, I may not be able to speak to the higher power, but I can speak for those who don't have that voice. So I think his position here, to me, is unchallenged.
Yeah. And theologically, wonderfully grounded in a foundational idea that transcends all of those questions about, let's call it kind of social power or earthly status or what markers of success might have been centuries ago and now, where there's something on every page of what he wrote, and something that I hope his spirit embedded here can continue to remind us and inspire us from many different backgrounds and perspectives, especially for young people. And it's everyone matters infinitely. The same amount of dignity, the same amount of love, the same amount of blessing and grace, and that being made in the image of God is the first thing, is the first thing for every being. So perhaps many, many more, much, much more rather than many of the other folks whose names also, as people who did their thing, would have had fears and hopes and joys and sorrows, but in some ways with Kugwano's story, much more. We have a real challenge to remember that there's a mutual responsibility to those whose names we do not know. The stories that probably won't make it onto some fancy monument today or in the past or in future, and that's something for which I think we've got to be accountable. A church is a good place to explore prayerfully why some things happen in the world and other things do not happen in the world because of the connection to human endeavor, love, justice, imagination. Now, it's getting late, and the light has faded. All of these soft lights are on in church, from Albert Richardson's 1950s post-war reworking of Wren's vision. We have this glowing reredos, and I am so grateful that you wanted to join me for this conversation. I am really pleased that you're here at St. James's and that we were able to reflect together on your impressions and your experiences of this place in your time as an architect and as someone who knows so deeply about these local histories and about these personal stories. Thank you so much.
And thank you. It's been an absolute delight. I've really, really enjoyed being here.